Second World War, and tens of thousands of young Africans were drafted overseas. The conflict was never really theirs, but for the first time they saw the conditions of their subjugated countries from the outside. They played their part in the winning of great victories, not least in Burma. In 1941, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt issued the famous Atlantic Charter, their grand promise that after the war, we shall respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. Africa's returning soldiers heard this pledge, and it raised high hopes.
The promises they had before the war, that after the war, some of them will be given better jobs and better pay, good money and so on, all the rest of it, and they had nothing.
The aura of superiority which had been there all along was destroyed by that war, at least for those soldiers who fought side by side with whites. Thereafter, on their return home, nobody could expect them to regard the white man as some little god. He was human, he had his weaknesses, he had his fears, and so on.
When peace came in 1945, nothing in the colonial landscape seemed different from before. Yet beneath the apparent calm, strong political pressures were building up. Even in remote rural areas, the message for a different future began to be heard. As well as the returning soldiers and their newfound aspirations, the seething expansion of many colonial towns, often 2 or 3 times bigger than before the war, also gave Africa's political leaders a mass audience for the first time. The struggle for independence moved firmly into the streets. Even the slow growth of primary education, wherever that occurred in some British, French and Belgian colonies, began to have a liberating influence. And that influence was carried further by young Africans now studying overseas.
Ils sont, tout, étonnés.
Up and down the country, you meet them everywhere. Men and women from the British colonies, working with us, learning from us. Nowadays, they and we share a common citizenship. But today we also share with them a common purpose, a partnership in progress and prosperity for us both. To us in the factory at home, this plan for mutual exchange may seem remote. But we are, every one of us, a part of it. For if the colonies are to send us the food and raw materials we're short of, we must send them the tools to do the job. We shan't complete so great a task overnight, but from every piece of equipment we can send to the colonies now, we stand to share the benefit ourselves in the future.
Looking back, one may well marvel at the complacency of the men who ruled the colonies from the tranquil corridors of Westminster and Whitehall. They saw no need to allow for any major political change, except in Britain's 4 West African colonies. And even there, the rulers wanted to move very slowly. Indeed, these worthy men deceived themselves, and their awakening to reality came from where it was least expected, from the Gold Coast, always considered to be Britain's model colony. A dramatic day of 1948 here in the capital Accra shattered that official complacency. Gold Coast troops had fought hard battles in Burma. They'd been part of what was called the Forgotten Army. Home again, the survivors once more felt themselves forgotten. They decided to march to the castle and present their grievances to the governor. With the castle already in sight, they arrived at this point along the road to its approach, and here they ran into a cordon of police armed with rifles barring the way. This angered the ex-servicemen. They'd come in peace. Now there were protests, shouts. Tear gas was thrown by the police and stones were thrown back. The march had begun to fray into a fight. at which point the European officer in charge of the police lost his head. He snatched a rifle from one of his men and opened fire with it into the marching veterans, killing or wounding several of them.
I saw exactly what happened. They were stopped, and then the soldiers started shooting. Why should they stop them? Then they start throwing tear gas to disperse them. And through the tear gas, all of them, they scattered all over the place, and they took stones. They started to throw stones. And through the tear gas, the enemy gave a command, and they started to shoot. I was right behind them, just like that. They started to shoot.
Lance Corporal Atipo, he was shot, dead. Another colleague of mine, a classmate of mine at Kofrodia, he was shot at the hip. I gathered him with a couple of my friends and put him on the wayside. But it looked awkward. One will fight in Burma for 3 good years, returning home and then come to die at the crossroad. I mean, the whole thing took us by surprise.
Then one soldier fell, another fell, and the third one. The fourth one, it's a schoolboy who was standing right between the two of us, myself and a friend of mine, behind. A bullet came through him and the boy fell. I held him up and found that the bullet passed through his thighs and came out from his buttocks. He fell, died later.
In itself, this was a rather small colonial killing, and yet it was to have a tremendous significance, for it exploded into rioting and looting here at Accra and rapidly in other towns. And those riots were the prelude to a strong political demand for independence. And that demand for independence now found its spokesman, a young nationalist with a vision of a free and progressive Africa. His name was Kwame Nkrumah. He formed a party for immediate action, and thousands rallied. His right-hand man was Komlo Bedama.
We got more following because we were more youthful, more active, and more forceful in our speeches. As a result, the youth, of course, it's more especially because of Nkrumah's personality, they flocked to our side.
Because you pushed harder.
We pushed harder and asked for more things than the elders would do. We wanted self-government now. When the Kuse Constitution came out, they said some form of self-government should be given to the people. We said we wanted full self-government now.
Big news from the Gold Coast, where the people recently went to the polls under the new constitution. The paramount chief of Accra was there with his retinue to record his vote, and everywhere in the capital, the people gathered to play their part in the democratic process, the free election of members of the Legislative Assembly.
Although Nkrumah himself had been thrown into prison for political reasons by the British, polling was peaceful. African voters proved to a skeptical colonial government that they could use the ballot box as well as anyone else. 2 main parties contested the election, and the result was an overwhelming victory for Nkrumah and his movement. Bowing to this result, Britain changed its policy and offered power, but purely over internal affairs, to an African government. The offer was accepted, and Nkrumah became the first of many African leaders to move directly from political imprisonment to the seat of power.
The whole world rejoiced in 1951 when Nkrumah had become the leader of government business straight from jail. And they were watching us to see what we were going to do. So it was important for us to try and show that we were responsible persons, not street boys just come into office. We went down to the work of running the administration, and some of us really hit it. We made a mark.
In 1954, with new elections and another victory for Nkrumah and his party, the Gold Coast edged another step towards independence. 7 years earlier, the British had withdrawn from India. Now they set about dismantling their African empire. Under Nkrumah's lead, these were exciting days. Professor Edu Bwahen remembers.
The 1950s, to me, were the most important and the most fascinating period in the history of this country. This was the period of the struggle for independence. It was a period of hope, period of expectations, great expectations. And this was the period when far more was achieved during the period from 1951 to 1954. Saw a pace of development in this country which it has never seen.
In 1957, the British duly completed their promise, and the Gold Coast became the first colony south of the Sahara to win its independence. Nkrumah renamed the country after an ancient West African empire. He called it Ghana.
Ghana, Ghana is the name, Ghana. We wish to proclaim, we will be jolly, merry and gay, the 6th of March, Independence Day.
It was one of the truly memorable moments in Africa's recent history that I've been privileged to watch and witness. By winning independence, Nkrumah fired the imagination and raised the hopes of black people everywhere. Not only in the Gold Coast, or Ghana as it now became, but throughout the Black Continent and even across the seas. They believed that Ghana's independence was going to be good news for them as well. And Nkrumah, for his part, was determined to prove them right.
At long last, the battle has ended. Your beloved country is free forever. Today, from now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that, after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. And we again rededicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate other territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it links up with the total liberation of the African continent.
Nkrumah lost no time in proving that he meant just what he said, that Ghana must lead the way for the liberation of all the other colonies. He saw beyond nationalism. He saw it as a prelude in Africa to internationalism, to the building of a unity and freedom that should become continent-wide. In Ghana at this time was the future leader of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe.
His Pan-Africanist approach that Africa must be united, that the rest of Africa, which was still under colonial rule, must be freed. Those were very, very important ideas. And we continued even after I had quit teaching to travel to Ghana nearly on a yearly basis to hold conferences there and to get inspired by Kwame Nkrumah.
200 delegates to the All-African People's Conference heard a speech much to their liking by the Prime Minister of Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah.
Fighters for African freedoms, I appeal to you in the sacred name of Mother Africa to leave this conference resolved to rededicate yourselves to the task of forming among the political parties in your respective countries a broad united front based upon one common fundamental aim and object, the speedy liberation of your territories. This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
Among nationalists inspired by Nkrumah's words at that conference was a delegation from another British colony, Kenya. Unlike Ghana, Kenya was one of a whole group of colonies where Africans had long pressed for peaceful progress, but in vain. the reason was clear. This was a settler colony, home of a strong and well-established white community centered around the prosperous city of Nairobi. These Kenya settlers, fearing to lose their privileged standard of living, were determined to frustrate all African requests for change. Early in the 1950s, the settlers pushed for still stronger political protection, and the colonial government gave way. Settler agitation thrust aside all thought of concessions, especially now that African protest began to take a desperate form. In 1952, a state of emergency was declared. The leading African spokesman, Jomo Kenyatta, was arrested with 200 others and sent into detention. 100,000 Africans were rounded up, many in Nairobi, and deported to crowded rural areas. And the outcome was an armed uprising on an unprecedented scale in British African colonies. Its scene was the White Highlands, where the settlers had taken the land of Kenya's largest people, the Kikuyu. 50 years earlier, a British officer had made a remarkable prophecy. If white settlement really takes hold in this country, he wrote, it's bound to do so at the expense of the Kikuyu, who had the best land, and I can foresee much trouble. And 50 years later, from their base in the dense forests north of Nairobi, as many as 20,000 fighters had taken up arms against the colonial authorities.
Through more than 4 years of desperate and sometimes terrible clashes, more than 9,000 Africans lost their lives. Fewer than 50 Europeans were killed, and yet the colonial government and the white settlers could see in the rebels nothing more than savage murderers bent on the mindless killing of white people and lost to all reason in the depths of superstition. They called the rebels Mau Mau, a term of contempt. But the rebels gave themselves a different name. Mostly they were simple people, few of whom could read or write, and yet they had a clear and exact idea of what they were fighting and dying for. They called themselves the Land and Freedom Army.
Kira gatumire tuthie mutito nie ndirute kuthie kurwira Mau Mau ni undu wa githaka na wiathi kuma hindi yo marakara nimo matumire ndonye mutito wa Aberdare kuringana na oguo ni twaruire tondu ndatonyire mutito 1953 na ndachokire kumira 1955
ndaiguire ndina uru nundu wa mugunda wa baba gutunyanwo gwitunyanwo kwa njira ya mahitia na gutire mugunda ungi ona umwe twatigeirio uguo ngiona kihoto ni guthii thiini wa mutitu ngarowe nigetha mugunda ucio wa baba ugacoka kana ngena mugunda ungi.
Land was the crux of the conflict. The land the Africans had lost, the land the settlers were determined to keep. The spiral of violence went beyond the control of either side.
From the Cathedral of the Highlands in Nairobi are borne the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Roger Ruck and their 6-year-old son, Michael, a British family brutally murdered by the Mau Mau. Here in a lonely farmhouse, far from the comparative safety of the city, police dogs found the Rucks stabbed to death. But the Mau Mau strike not only at Europeans, their own people are often among their victims. Thick woods and jungle have to be penetrated to find the murderers, so Samburu tribesmen who know the country well join in the manhunt.
Many thousands of Africans were arrested and found themselves facing stiff sentences for their involvement in the uprising. Many thousands of others were detained in prison camps without any trial at all. Captive rebels remember the camps as places of painful suffering.
Na twarutaga wira wina hinya muno tondu eke imwe twacimbaga na thururu andu 50 o muthenya na ni twahuragwo muno tondu na kiugo ni kwaigitwo thigari cia gutuhuraga ni athungu na ni menjete irima mwathiururuka andu matakuite andu teri mutingitiga kuhurwo.
But the strength of the British Army and its counterinsurgency tactics proved far too powerful for the makeshift troops of the Mau Mau. In October 1956, the rebel commander, Dedan Kimati, was at last captured and hanged, and the 4-year-old rebellion was crushed. But although militarily defeated, the forest fighters soon knew that the political battle was won. The rebellion was followed by an attempt to heal the wounds, yet nothing could be the same as before. No matter what efforts at civilian reconstruction might be made, the British now understood that there could no longer be any future for colonial rule in Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta, the man whom a British governor had called the leader to darkness and death, was released from prison to become the honored president of an independent nation. Among the many influential new leaders of other former British colonies was the humane and far-seeing Julius Nyerere. Happily for him, Tanzania and neighboring countries, Uganda, Malawi, Zambia, freedom came without an armed struggle, as it did for the most powerful African country of them all, the Great Federation of Nigeria. And Britain departed from tropical Africa to the general satisfaction of all concerned. And the new leaders, like those of Nigeria, accepted happily, at least to begin with, the British pattern of parliamentary rule. All that mattered at this stage was freedom. In the vast African empire of France, there were few white settlers to displace, and many black nationalists could travel a relatively peaceful road towards independence. But in Algeria, with a large French population, a major war lasted through the 1950s. It was a tragedy which reproduced every horror of the Kenya rebellion, but on a huge scale. A well-organized guerrilla army with mass support fought to end a racist and oppressive French administration dominated, as in Kenya, by white settlers. As many as 700,000 French troops were poured in with all the available military hardware at their disposal. It was to prove the most savage war of independence Africa had seen. Even an electrified fence with 900,000 landmines was strung round Algeria's borders in a bid to cut off the rebels from outside help. Sheer military power very nearly defeated the liberation fighters, but their popular support, despite ruthless reprisals, never collapsed. About 1 million Algerians died, including many of their outstanding young leaders. The French Republic was torn apart, and France itself was threatened with civil war. Into this catastrophe stepped France's wartime hero, Charles de Gaulle. While moving secretly to concede independence to Algeria, he set about bolstering French colonial positions south of the Sahara. Touring these colonies with all his pride and panache, de Gaulle offered political rights within a French community, within, that is, the enclosing power of France. The future president of Senegal, Léopold Senghor, recalls those days.
Le général de Gaulle était un nationaliste. Il mettait la France, n'est-ce pas, au-dessus de tout. Mais c'est un homme qui avait le sens de l'histoire. Le général de Gaulle nous a compris, mais la plupart des partis en France ont pratiqué la politique du diviser pour régner quand il s'est agi de nous accorder l'autonomie d'abord et l'indépendance ensuite.
In Senegal, as in all the French colonies except Guinea, which struck out on its own, de Gaulle's offer was accepted. Nationalist leaders stepped smartly into the palaces of the departing French governors, and political independence duly followed. Each of the new states of the former French Empire adopted the French model of parliamentary government with a national assembly and set out to make
its independent mark on the world. But most of them were small or with little population and resources, heavily dependent on France, and France was able to retain a tight financial and even military control, a control that was going to endure for many years into the future.
The wind of change blowing through the Belgian Congo, and down comes the Belgian flag in Leopoldville, a few days, in fact, in advance of independence. Elected as Prime Minister of the new Congo Republic, Mr. Patrice Lumumba receives congratulations from members of both Houses of Parliament.
The applause was ready, but little else. Belgium had allowed this huge colony just 6 months to prepare for its independence. Britain gave Nigeria the best part of 10 years. President Kasavubu might have the right clothes for the job, but that unhappily was about all. The much more able Prime Minister Lumumba had to rely on men of no experience.
I found myself at the age of 27, minister in the cabinet in Kinshasa and ambassador to the United Nations. Among the 36 cabinet ministers and secretary of state were just 3 of us holding university degrees.
With few Belgian officials left to help, chaos erupted. The Congolese army mutinied and rampaged. Whole provinces rebelled. Situated between a newly independent Africa to the north and the white-ruled colonial south, the Congo, with its rich mineral wealth, became the victim of outside interference.
They saw their economic, especially, and financial interest threatened by the kind of men like Lumumba. So personally, at United Nations, I had a feeling that we are going to face chaos, and it didn't take time before United Nations troops move in. And as you know, United Nations troops were financed mainly by United States of America and Western countries. So we changed from the Belgian colonialism to international colonialism.
United Nations troops had come in response to an appeal from Prime Minister Lumumba. Some of them were from newly liberated African states, with the strongest reasons for wanting to see a stable Congo. But the United Nations failed to uphold him. For the UN, this was a humiliating setback. For Lumumba, it was a death sentence. The rebellious army commander Mobutu was able to arrest him. And in scenes of outrageous brutality, the Congo's first prime minister was handed over to foreign-backed rebels fighting for control of the mineral wealth of Katanga province. There he was tortured and, in the end, secretly murdered. For those with hopes of a generally peaceful transfer of power, as the remaining colonial governments continued their withdrawal, the Congo was a disaster.
Ignoring all the circumstances which had led to that disaster, the enemies of black Africa used it as evidence that Africans could not be left to govern themselves. A diplomat from Ghana, Mr. Yao Jackson, recalls his own reaction.
So certainly the Congo came as a great disappointment and in a sense as a great defeat for what Nkrumah or the Pan-Africanists would have wished the world to believe. There was no more unity, even among the African countries, not to mention the confusion in Congo itself.
But the Pan-African idea was still very much alive. In 1963, in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa, 32 independent countries came together to form the Organization of African Unity. The aims were defined by Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere.
This conference has been faced with one task. It is the task of finding a common denominator which will guide us in our determination to rid our continent of the remaining vestiges of colonialism, and in our determination to see an Africa speaking with one single voice.
And the OAU did indeed prove valuable, at least in its early years. Yet loyalties to Pan-Africanism varied.
The OAU was a great unifying point, but you will recall that the charter of the OAU was a compromise between the two extremes. There was, on the other hand, Nkrumah's vision of a unitary continental government, and then you had what later became the Monrovia Group of Nations, including the French-speaking Nigeria, Liberia, and so on, who wanted a much more moderate approach. And the OAU was a compromise solution. So from that point of view, it was a great disappointment to the Nkrumah's idea of a continental government, of a unitary African continental government.
This complex, built for the OAU in Accra, is a reminder of Nkrumah's all-consuming drive for African unity, which was to lead, ironically and even disgracefully, to his downfall. His critics were able, with increasing truth, to accuse him of neglecting or mishandling the affairs of his own country. In 1966, while he was away in the Far East on a mission aimed at helping to make peace for Vietnam, discontented generals rebelled and overthrew his government. He had to live out his last years in a sad exile, where he died in 1972. Yet his place in modern African history was already assured as a certainly controversial but powerful force for liberating change. There were many who thought that once the major colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, had voluntarily surrendered their African empires, smaller ones would be ready to do the same. It was not to be. Stubbornly obtuse to the last, Portugal's dictatorship held on grimly to its African colonies in the face of widening resistance. In Angola and Mozambique, guerrilla armies were increasingly active, while the tiny colony of Guinea-Bissau, a country almost forgotten by the world, was gripped in a desperate struggle. Here, dense forests and mangrove-lined creeks were the chosen field of battle for a small but determined army of guerrillas led by an outstanding African strategist, Amilcar Cabral.
We think that all the time there still be colonies in Africa. Africa will not be really independent. We think that our people have the obligation to liberate our country, see, to contribute for the liberation of Africa.
Heavily outnumbered by the well-armed troops of Portugal, Cabral's men began their struggle in early 1963. No help came from the West. Portugal, after all, was part of the NATO alliance, and none of Portugal's partners was prepared to aid or encourage anti-colonial rebellion. So, not for the first time, an African liberation movement turned for help to the communist world. Here, accompanied by a British film crew, the guerrillas attack one of the many fortified Portuguese garrisons. This one, called Buba, possessed an important oil dump.
Our army is not a military organization like the other armies you know. You see, our army is an instrument of our people to fight for independence. It developed from nothing until now what you have seen, you see. But the principal character of our army is that we are not military people. We are armed militants, you see. And after independence, after have realized our goal, the major part of these people have to go back to cultivate the soil.
For me, who knew him through hard and very testing years, Cabral was the most far-seeing of all the political thinkers and men of action who have devoted themselves to the liberation of Africa from colonial rule and from the negative aspects of Africa's own past. Tragically, he was unable to preside over the freedom which his leadership had done so much to make possible. In 1973, he was struck down by assassins in the pay of the enemy. In Mozambique, the army of Frelimo had also made progress, with thousands of young men and women committed to the struggle. But like other nationalist movements in periods of great tension, Frelimo had to overcome internal divisions in the leadership. It was in 1968 that Frelimo, Mozambique's liberation movement, held a crucially important congress in a liberated zone of the Mozambican province of Niassa, north of where I am now. I was the only European to have been invited and to be present, and for days I listened to the delegates, some 150 of them, as they hammered out their policies. A minority was for trying to negotiate a compromise with the Portuguese. But the majority argued that any compromise would be bound to spell defeat and disaster for the whole movement and its aims. The majority view prevailed. Events had shown that no compromise was possible. Within a few months, Frelimo's first president, Eduardo Mondlane, was assassinated by Portuguese agents. But into his place stepped his closest supporter, the Frelimo commander, Samora Machel.
A nossa guerra era popular, não? Concessão. Primeiro é preciso ter uma concessão clara, política. Uma concessão clara política para poder conceber a política do inimigo, conceber os objetivos do inimigo e para poder avaliar corretamente a força do inimigo. Sem esta compreensão política, em primeiro lugar, não é possível fazer uma estratégia correta.
For Samora, the starting point of analysis was always political, but he quickly revealed himself to be a first-rate commander in the field and a brilliant strategist.
Definimos Tete como o ponto central, a província vital para o desenvolvimento da luta de libertação de Moçambique. Considerávamos Tete o dorso do camelo, entende? O dorso do camelo. Camel's back. dorso de camelo. É ali o ponto decisivo, o ponto nevrálgico. Então definimos o Tete. É assim que nós fizemos o documento em 1970. Compreender e assumir a Batalha de Tete. E por quê? Tete fazia fronteira com Manica e Sofala, onde havia maior implantação de colonos. Onde era o centro de desdobramento das forças do inimigo. Portanto, nós decidimos, é preciso plantar no estômago do inimigo os germes que provocam cancro.
Samora's problem was to push the war from the north into the south. His forces in the liberated zones faced the solid bulk of the Portuguese army, barring the way. So, by way of a new supply line, he thrust guerrilla units south through the province of Tete, cutting into the enemy's communications.
É como que luta de boxe, não? É? A esquerda sempre prepara condições, não é verdade? Mas a direita para ser demolidor. Entende, Basil? É? A direita conservada como demolidor. E é assim que nós infiltramos as nossas forças, atravessar o Zambeze, abrir a frente de Manica e Sofala e operar a retaguarda do inimigo, para não ter a logística. Era preciso destruir a logística do inimigo, a retaguarda do inimigo, nas linhas interiores do inimigo.
Not even ruthless airstrikes could help the arrogant Portuguese commander, General Causa de Arriaga. He told his officers that the black people are the least intelligent of all the peoples in the world and could never win the war. But Frelimo had proved him singularly wrong, and now his outmaneuvered troops hit blindly at the civilian population. These liberation wars were long and painful. Every kind of military devilry was unleashed upon the liberation movements by the Portuguese colonial armies, which were also, of course, fascist armies, in order to break their spirit and divide them from their crucial base in popular support. Here was Wiriamu, scene of one of the worst acts of Portuguese militarist terror, when in 1972, a whole village, more than 400 people, was wiped out in a vain attempt to hold up the advance of Frelimo's liberation fighters. This empty place today is a grim reminder of the price that had to be paid to end the enormities of colonial rule. In 1975, Portugal's empire in Africa was finally destroyed, and with it fell the Portuguese dictatorship. As many as 500,000 Portuguese settlers hastily departed, spurning appeals that they should stay to help rebuild the newly independent countries. A colossal pile of wrecked military transport was left to mark the graveyard of the Portuguese war machine. Nothing anywhere, perhaps, could better illustrate the waste and futility of these Portuguese wars, fought so long and hard against every pleading of good sense, and at such a cost to the people of Portugal as well as to peoples in Africa. Across the border in Rhodesia were 250,000 white people of mainly British stock, for whom this prosperous land with its pleasant climate was home. They were just as determined not to see their comfortable existence undermined. For years, the leaders of the large black majority worked for political progress by peaceful means. Those who stepped outside the rules as laid down by the whites might find themselves in detention without the benefit of a trial. But others would step forward, form parties, and press for change, all according to the constitutional game. In 1965, the white minority leader Ian Smith tore up those rules when he declared a unilateral independence aimed at preventing any sharing of power with the blacks.
How long, in your opinion, will it be before Rhodesia has one man, one vote, and whatever government that produces?
I hope never. I hope we never degenerate to that sort of thing, which is the counting of heads like counting of sheep. I think government is a very important thing. I think it's a great responsibility to have a vote. And if one wants to maintain high standards and maintain our Western civilization, then I believe we've got to maintain our standards. I would rather see the standards raised in Rhodesia than lowered.
Maintaining standards, in the view of Ian Smith, meant a rebellion against Britain in order to ensure that the black majority should never be able to raise its own standards to those of the white population, as he himself boasted, not for 1,000 years. Looking back today, the first black Prime Minister, Robert Mugabe, explains why, in reality, the power of the gun was now all that could count.
UDI was based on military strength. There is nothing that we could do in those circumstances unless we armed ourselves. And so we had to work out some mechanism for bringing about the downfall of UDI. And that mechanism, if it was to be effective, had to be an armed one.
This is the Rhodesia Broadcasting Corporation.
Listen to what women are saying about new cold water Omo.
It's fantastic. Just
There's a lot of living to do, with a lot of pleasure for you.
Half-hearted economic sanctions by the outside world allowed the whites to believe that it could be business as usual. But the guerrilla armies were growing in strength and efficiency. One of their fighters, a school teacher, gave his reasons for going to war.
And what do? How do we correct it? We have spoken, we have addressed meetings, we have even gone to the United Nations. Our leaders have. They've gone everywhere. They've gone all over. They've been to Britain. They expressed their opinions about the sufferings of their people. They went to the United Nations. They sought all means, possible means of solving the problems. And nobody bothered to listen. Nobody bothered to care about it. And what do? We can't remain as we are. We can't remain with that 10 acres allocated to my family. It's too small. Why do we deserve that one? We have to correct it. We have to correct this situation. Whether by suffering, we have chosen to suffer. And this we have. That's why we are in the forest. We'll remain so until that land is free.
Rhodesia at last became the independent state of Zimbabwe in 1980, nearly a quarter of a century after Ghana. How many more years must it be before the last great bastion of racist rule would fall?
Behind me, some 200 yards away, lies South Africa, the country of apartheid, of a systematic racism, denying any human rights to black people. No system in Africa since the slave trade, it seems to me, has offered so vile an outrage to human decency. Against every condemnation by the civilized world, the profiteers of apartheid have continued to pursue their path of violence.
As in so many other African countries where change has been demanded by a black majority, the white minority have replied with violence and repression. A series of trials saw anti-apartheid leaders, both black and white, being jailed. Nelson Mandela, leader of the banned African National Congress, has been behind bars for over 20 years. The massacre of innocent people in the towns of Sharpeville and Langer in 1960 proved to be the turning point. Peaceful protest against apartheid had led to the police shooting into the crowd, killing 83 people and wounding 365. This was the event, more than any other, that proved to the black leaders that armed struggle could no longer be avoided. The exiled president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo.
Well, because we felt we had reached the end of the road for nonviolence. Not only had our struggle been nonviolent, we had specifically tried desperately to avoid being provoked, refuse to be provoked by a policy of violence which the government had embarked upon. And violence against us was mounting, and we're making no impact whatsoever on the regime. There was no response of any kind. And we'd reached a position where we had to choose between surrendering, doing nothing at all, or fighting, and we decided to fight.
Mass shooting began again in 1976, another turning point, when children in the vast township of Soweto near Johannesburg refused to attend school as a protest against apartheid. Hundreds of them were shot down by the police.
The massacre itself shocked everybody, including South Africans and the international community, into a new awareness of the utterly criminal nature of the apartheid system. But it did something else. There was an uprising in response to the massacre. This was a great development, an uprising by the young people in Soweto and all over the country.
A year later, in circumstances which have never been satisfactorily explained, the popular student leader Steve Biko died in prison in Port Elizabeth of brain damage while he was being held in chains. At his funeral, every important strand of black opinion in South Africa came together in a united gesture of defiance. Nothing inside South Africa, it seems, can now disarm the growing violence of apartheid and resistance to it. Unless outside powers withdraw the essential support they continue to give to the system, South Africa's rulers are clearly determined to concede to the black majority no more than cosmetic changes, and those will prove futile.
But whatever may befall in South Africa, and there must remain a hope for peaceful change, one thing has become certain. No amount of racist aggression or assassination is going to be able to withstand the onward surge and drive of a people longing and determined to be free. And freedom, whatever problems it may bring with it, is the only sure groundwork for peace.